So, listen to this. In about a week, James Milner will have played more Premier League matches than any other player in history. 654. Yet, ask most fans and they'll tell you that he hasn't had a single memorable moment. That it makes sense. The most boring record for the most boring player ever. But they have no idea what they're talking about. Once upon a time, boring old Milner was the most exciting young player in the country. Long before he was in contention to become the oldest goal scorer in Premier League history, he had stepped up to Michael Owen and Wayne Rooney and broken their record as the youngest ever. This isn't the story of a boring player who just stuck around for longer than anyone else. It's the story of a Wonderkid who got chewed up by the system again and again, but refused to disappear. Look, as a child, Milner excelled at everything. Make no mistake, already back then he was the machine. Not only was he one of the top students in his school, he played for their cricket team, was their cross-country champion for 3 consecutive years, and a district champion for the 100 meters for another 2. All while he played academy football for Leeds United, getting signed up at only 12 years old after a scout came back with a report that was borderline perfect. Technical and tactical ability, both 5 out of 5. Physical fitness, 5 out of 5. Psychological profile, 5 out of 5. Only 3 years later, before he had even left school, he was already training with the first team. Robbie Fowler, Robbie Keane, Jonathan Woodgate and Rio Ferdinand were just 4 of his teammates. Now, if you're thinking that's an awful lot of big names for a team like Leeds, that's the thing. After winning the last league title before the foundation of the Premier League, the club became determined to repeat that achievement before terms like the modern era led everyone to forget the first. So, over the turn of the century, their ridiculous overspending had allowed them to build a squad capable of making it past Barcelona, Real Madrid and AC Milan on its way to a Champions League semi-final, and Milner was supposed to be their crown jewel. However, despite their chairman spending thousands of British pounds on an aquarium of tropical fish, all either yellow, white or blue in the club's colours as a charm of good luck, the gamble failed. With all their financial plans depending on their qualification to the Champions League, after being 1 point off the top on New Year's, Leeds collapsed all the way down to 5th place, meaning all 4 players I mentioned before were sold in order to bail them out, and by the following November, with Leeds in the bottom half of the table, 16-year-old James Milner was put on the bench for a match against Everton. It was 2002. Abramovich was yet to take over Chelsea, Beckham was still playing for United, and naturally, 16-year-old Rooney, who had just become the youngest goal scorer in the league's history, was on the pitch. The whole game, Milner did not take his eyes off him, and everyone noticed. By the end, the coach tapped him on the shoulder and asked, "You're desperate to do what he's doing, aren't you?" 2 weeks later, he debuted as the 2nd youngest player in the league's history, and if, looking at him, people had a hard time believing he was 16, then, with his first touch he passed the ball straight to Di Canio and almost allowed him to complete a 4-goal comeback. In the locker room, they mocked him. "Did you have a bet on a 4-goal draw?" Yet, the jokes didn't last long. By Boxing Day, he had already broken Rooney's record, and the very next game, still feeling that Rooney's debut wonder goal was overshadowing him, he dropped Marcel Desailly and curled the ball into the far post to open the score against Chelsea. Only 2 months after Rooney had gotten the commentators to yell, "Remember the name," now they yelled, "The name's Milner, James Milner." Yet, their careers would follow completely different paths. By the age of 23, Milner would have played under 13 different managers. As Leeds finished 15th in the table, quickly their teenage sensation on a scholar's contract worth £80 a week became their only hope, and so, a year later, they had already succumbed to relegation. At least, in a gesture of good faith, no matter how much he insisted he wanted to help his childhood club bounce back, they damn near forced the kid out of the club, claiming it was just wrong to put a talent like James in the championship. But, unfortunately, just like at Leeds, Milner arrived right as Newcastle's turn-of-the-century resurgence came to an end. Despite being their 2nd biggest signing of the season, 3 games in, Bobby Robson got sacked, and with Souness in his place, not only did Newcastle finish 14th only a year after UEFA Cup semi-final, but Milner was completely discarded, only being given his first full 90 in April, as his own manager claimed that you don't win anything with a team of James Milners. But that would become the most embarrassing statement of his career. Once Milner got loaned out to Villa as counterweight in the purchase of Norberto Solano, Newcastle were surprised to hear David O'Leary insist that somehow Villa had gotten the better player. But he was right, so much so that by the end of the season, Villa were putting every other transfer target on hold so they could lock in funds for his permanent signing. However, on deadline day, with the clubs finally reaching an agreement, Milner drove back down to Villa to sign his contract, only to go into Martin O'Neill's office and be told, "Haven't you heard? They've pulled the plug." Milner laughed that off, but it wasn't a joke. Sure, that next year, Milner ended up making the most appearances out of anyone at Newcastle. In January, he even scored the club's goal of the season against United, but even if Sam Allardyce, who'd take over the following year, would claim Milner was so determined to succeed, he'd have to tell him to slow down before he burns out mentally. The reality is that he felt stuck. In his absence, Villa, the club he wished to be playing for, had rose up to 6th place, while Newcastle were closer to the bottom than the top, and internationally, as much as Capello referred to him as the future, he was beginning to seem like a prime candidate to the under-21 curse. In England, players who've made a lot of under-21 appearances tend to never become regulars for the senior team, and Milner was still playing for them on a technicality since, despite being 6 months off of his 24th birthday by his final tournament, it would be the age at the start of the qualifying rounds that would count, meaning soon he'd be on 46 caps for the under-21s, 17 more than anyone else in history, without ever getting his proper national team debut. 7 seasons had passed by, and while Rooney had just won the Champions League, Milner was still stuck at the starting line. So once and for all, he forced a permanent move out to Villa, and at last, the stars lined up for him. Already in that first season, Milner helped Villa to their best points tally in a decade, scoring a thunderbolt in January to force himself onto Capello's call-up and finally breaking the curse over summer. But it was on his second season, which many have now forgotten, that we saw Milner's prime. With 12 goals and 16 assists, Milner not only helped Villa to an even better league finish than their previous one, once again scoring the goal of the season, but pushed even further in the League Cup, scoring in the quarters, and then completely taking over the semis by scoring twice and assisting another 2 to beat Blackburn 7-4 on aggregate, before popping up to Wembley and opening the score against Man United, teasing the fans with the possibility of a first trophy in 15 years for 71 minutes, after which, unfortunately, he saw Rooney close off the comeback. However, it did not stop Milner from being named Villa's Player of the Season, making the league's Team of the Year, and above all, despite already having 326 appearances under his belt, being named the PFA's Young Player of the Year, reminding everyone why he had once been deemed a Wonderkid, leveraging that into a World Cup call-up and finally getting his big move. Now, why Villa decided to trade the Young Player of the Year for only £10 million plus a guy who'd rather show off his pinked-out Bentley than his trophies, I don't know. But one thing is sure, when Stephen Ireland warned Milner that the grass may look greener on the other side, but he's going to get a shock at City, he was actually quite right. Don't get me wrong, Milner's move to City was successful. It gave his name enough credibility that for 10 minutes in a friendly against France, he even captained the English national team. And right on that first season, he even won his first trophy, which he himself had claimed was the sole reason for leaving Villa. But really, he was just as lost there as he was in Newcastle. All year, he was played out wide instead of in his preferred box-to-box role, and even then, he was mostly left out of big games in exchange for Samir Nasri, so much so that he ended up watching that FA Cup triumph from the bench, and the second season wasn't much different. As the league title came down to the final match day, once again, Milner was an unused substitute in the greatest match in the club's history, even though he had likely been the man of the match as they beat their title rival 6-1 a few months before. Already then, he was going home in tears, feeling the managers only kept on leaving him out because unlike the more technical players, he was less likely to kick up a fuss, and so it continued. Every year, Milner was made into more and more of a role player, slowly morphing into a background character when he had fought so hard to fulfill his destiny of being a superstar. By the third, they finally let him play a final, but they shockingly lost it to Wigan Athletic out of all teams. By the fourth, not only did he go back to the bench as they took another League Cup, but he only started 12 matches as he won a second league title. It barely felt like any of this success was truly his. And to make matters worse, as a disillusioned Milner started becoming infamous for his cliched, unenthusiastic interviews, football came up with a nickname for him: Boring Milner. The whole joke became so widespread that a parody account of him reached over 500,000 followers. So, on his 5th season, with his 30th birthday knocking on the door and his reputation as the league's best utility player leading him to play 9 different positions in 1 year, even though Pellegrini insisted that he meant nothing wrong by that he was Milner's #1 fan, Milner did not want any part of it anymore. That summer, after running down his contract, Milner arrived at Liverpool on a free transfer. With €0 invested in him, they had no real skin in the game, no real obligation to play him in the fans' eyes. The only insurance he had was Brendan Rodgers, the manager who signed him and immediately made him vice-captain. But he got sacked just 8 matches later. Then Klopp took his place and tore that team down to the studs. Out of the first 11 players he ever fielded, only one would really survive, and thankfully, it was James Milner. With 7 goals and 14 assists, he finished that first season with more goal contributions than Coutinho, than Firmino, than anyone in that squad. Things were going so good at Liverpool that after the 2016 Euros, now with 66 England caps to his name and having surely defeated any kind of curse, Milner retired from the national team so he could focus on club football. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows either. During pre-season, Klopp asked Milner to stay behind after a team meeting and asked him if he was willing to play the whole of next season at fullback. As the man who claimed he had played everywhere but at goalkeeper, fullback was the one position Milner avoided at all costs. It was very easy to see why some could think this was the same old story all over again, but Klopp was not disregarding him or leaving him behind. He was asking him specifically to make a sacrifice for the team because he trusted Milner above anyone else. And that made all the difference. Because after holding down the fort as Klopp worked on his rebuild, then, once Andy Robertson was signed to fill in that role, Klopp did not forget Milner. No, he instantly moved him back to the center of the pitch, and to everyone's shock, at 32 years old, Milner took over the Champions League. 2 assists against Maribor, 3 against Spartak, and then 1 against each of Porto, Man City and Roma, not just to put Liverpool in the Champions League final, but breaking the competition's all-time assist record that ironically had belonged precisely to Wayne Rooney. But even then, he'd still refuse a glass of wine during the celebrations, claiming he'd leave that to the other lads and enjoy himself some grape juice, which may be why, even though Rooney would already be retiring from the Premier League that season, after losing the final to Real Madrid, Milner was not only able to give it a second go the following year, but that time, coming true to his word that in order to become even stronger, Liverpool had to become more boring. It took a much more conservative approach, still scoring against PSG and assisting against Bayern, but shining much more as he became notorious for shutting down both Neymar and Messi on his way to a second Champions League final in a row, where, hilariously, despite it indeed being described by many as one of the most boring finals ever, Liverpool took the title, and Milner celebrated by going a bit exotic with a bit of lemonade. After that, already 34 years old, Milner had finally reached the heights everyone expected of him 18 years earlier, and, funnily enough, after struggling so long with his typecasting as the Premier League's Swiss Army knife, he embraced it. He became Liverpool's Mr. Everything, and from then on, James Milner played everywhere. And that isn't a figure of speech. Just look at his heat map. Yeah, there's virtually no part of the pitch he left untouched. You don't ever see any anything like that. And that's why Klopp was okay with keeping him around for 4 more years, reaching a 3rd Champions League final, winning everything else there was to win, and of course, helping Liverpool take their first league title in 30 years, becoming one of only 10 players to have won the Premier League with 2 different clubs. And if there needs to be any more proof that to stay at the top for that long, Milner needed much more than to embarrass his teammates at every pre-season lactate test, it's that, first of all, Klopp only agreed to let him leave after pressure from the board, and second, well, that a club like Brighton, that had almost no players above the age of 26, would open an exception for a 38-year-old Milner. Or, even worse, that after watching him go down injured only a year later, going up for surgery, getting nerve damage, and spending months without even being able to move his foot, fearing he may never walk properly again, he persevered, somehow coming back in time for the final game of the season, and then starting the 24th Premier League season of his career with a different number in honor of an old friend, and becoming only one of 5 outfield players to have stayed in the league after the age of 40. It's Teddy Sheringham, Ryan Giggs, Gordon Strachan, Kevin Phillips, and now James Milner, a Premier League legend.